I was very excited by what you said about Basso Continuo. Really, like it should be viewed as easy and as a way to get as a simplification of a harder system before. So, how do people get into Basso Continuo, and how do you teach it actually?
I think it's a combination of the way I learnt it was not to immediately get frightened of making mistakes with the counterpoint. Maybe it's a bit like learning a foreign language in the sense if you're scared of, but this is a very personal point of view. This isn't in any of the treatises or anything. Um, if you get too concerned that you're never going to that you mustn't ever make a mistake, then you don't say anything, you don't speak, you don't, and then that means you don't get to practice. But I took great heart from the treatises that say, like this one that I just quoted, the Rome one, but also Gasparini says when you play in practice, it's not always possible to do everything perfectly. And so I took that to heart, and you can't always prepare everything. You mustn't always play in four voices. It depends on very much on what you're accompanying. If you're accompanying something that's quiet, you may want to play just two voices. If you're accompanying something that's louder or more voices, then you'll want to play bigger chords, and therefore it's not possible to play as if you're composing. This is something that's also fascinating, I think, about Basso Continuo and performing Basso Continuo, because it's not the same thing as a composition. And the composers themselves, like Gasparini, who was also a composer, sort of let you off, as it were, and you don't, and say, you should know how to do it, but it might sometimes be desirable to not, play as if you're just play as if you're playing, you're only concentrating on the counterpoint and the voice leading. And so to go back to the original question, what I think this made me start to play in a way where, concentrating on the harmony basically, and this is the way I encourage my own students to make sure that first, the most important thing is to get harmony and rhythm right at the beginning. And so you start with, not with easy pieces, because it's not, but with more harmonically less complex pieces.
Can you give us some examples of just things that would be good for new people to
Well,
try?
anything basically that was the early 17th century, because as I said, it's not easier to accompany, and on the contrary, it's actually very complicated to accompany, but it's not harmonically hard, and it's a good repertoire in which to practice responsiveness, which is also an integral part. So there are many parts of continual playing. You've got to get the right harmonies, you've got to get the right rhythms, obviously.
And by early 17th century, did you have a composer or list of works in mind?
Well,
Or like a treatise that
composers like
people...
Caccini, for example. Caccini songs are they're very pleasant and very pretty, and you can practice cadential formulas and things like that. Or Peri, the early sort of Florentine Camerata type composers. Now, obviously, if you go to slightly later repertoire like Frescobaldi or Castello or Fontana or Monteverdi, it's already much more complicated, because here you have a sort of introduction of harmonies which aren't in the harmony, and so the composer writes harmonies which are not. Hang on, let me go back a second. The good thing about these early 17th century composers is because they were writing at the time in which Basso Continuo was simple, to go back to this overriding principle. Basso Continuo is simple, and in order to perform the very first operas and the very first songs that were composed with continuo notation, by that I mean they're actually specified as being Basso Continuo parts, and they have numbers. Just use three numbers. You have, everything is a 5/3 chord, unless it's a 6 chord, so it's a first inversion, and in that case it says, or it has a sharp or a flat. in which case it's major or minor chord. Is obviously it applies to the third, and that you can play all of that repertoire with those three simple rules. So that's the best place to start with. Now, obviously, if you immediately start to think, yes, but you might get a 6/4 at a cadence. Of course, you get a cadential sort of that's the most exotic thing you could have. You might have a seventh every now and then, but you're not going to have I don't know, a 6/4 slashed. You're not going to have more complicated
And that's in the early
harmonies. And so
17th century. You won't have that so
that's
much.
right.
Okay.
No, that's right. And this is, I mean, there's a very good description of these rules in Peri's introduction to L'Euridice. And he has just a tiny little paragraph and a tiny little stave with an example. This is in the preface to the printed edition, and he explains these three things. He says that's all you need to know, which is why Banchieri got so angry and said, "What on earth are you talking about? That's not all you need to know. You need to know far more than that in order to be able to be a real organist." But that is basically what is needed to, if anyone could, anyone with a bit of knowledge of harmony could do that, and that was the whole point. It was really easy.
Yeah.
So that was, I think that's a good place to start.
Then when does it get crazy? Then when do we need to learn? Because people love those chords, 6/4/2, 9 chords. D'Andrieu has the 9 chords. When do we get to learn all that stuff and put that in?
Is this still in a sort of pedagogical?
Yeah, absolutely,
idea?
yes. Because, and then I'm also going to ask you of Basso Continuo as a vehicle for composition. I guess that's linked to Partimento. But let's talk about just the learning phase first.
The learning phase. Well, D'Andrieu you mentioned is, I mean, yes, he's fantastic because his treatise is much more. It's better organized than the very early Italians, as I said earlier, were primarily concerned with colors that getting the instruments to play together, not so much about what the individual instrument was doing, which is also interesting, which is possibly why some of the things are harmonically simple. Well, not necessarily, but anyway. But D'Andrieu is very gradual in his exercises, and he actually uses the numbers in such a way as to, there they are. You can see he puts 8, 5, 3, and then 3. I can't read it, but anyway, it's basically the numbers he uses corresponds to the notes you must play.
Yeah.
So they're all 5/3 chords, all those first 4 chords. But he specifies in the first case that the octave should be at the top of the chord. He gives you the order in which.
That's very helpful.
And it's very helpful, especially at the beginning, because but this is also a characteristic of French style, the French style that French composers and all the treatises were very, very strong on the fact that you had to move from a chord to the next nearest chord, and so they were very into sort of voice leading. Whereas in Italian sources, there isn't that much. It's not mentioned as often, so they were sort of more interested in filling the chords with extra harmony notes and ornamentation.
Is that because you couldn't be heard otherwise? Because they didn't have like amps back then. Do they want to just make sure that you could hear them in the auditorium or something?
I don't know. It's not so. It doesn't.
It's a good
necessarily
question.
Increase volume.
We don't know.
Yes,
yeah.
Interesting. But well, there's a Frenchman, Leclerc de la Vieilleville, who says it was to do with showing off. That the continuo players always wanted to, because it's this improvisatory element to it. You have your bass line, but you can do whatever you want. I mean, it's you're playing it. So
That makes sense.
And
Yeah.
so he was saying that the cellist would do loads of divisions, and then the harpsichordist would start mucking around, and then it would all be, the composition would be completely disfigured, and nobody could hear the singer at all. So obviously that's cool, a bit too much, but maybe it was just maybe they were just bored and thought they would
Yeah, it's a
they
good.
were they were they were playing around. I mean, you can
It's
do
so rich, and it's
uh,
also a span of 150 years. It's impossible, I guess, to just sum it up in 3 lines. I mean, to say, oh, they played
yeah,
this way, so so yeah,
yes,
this whole
yeah.
country played it this way. It's I know, I can understand. Yeah.
It
Now,
wasn't even a country. Italy wasn't even
that's
formally a country. So no, I mean, but there are stylistic differences between how they were playing in Naples and how they were playing in Venice, and
yeah.
or in Florence. So
Great point. Great point.